I can hardly see. That light is reflective. I'm just going to leave that because the tree. All right. Mimi, I'll be right there. Trying to decide if this is too bad. I'm just going to stay with it, my shiny head. All right. Hi.
Hi, it's so sunny there.
So I need a reflector from my head, but
Yeah, you need a hat. You want to
I'm
borrow mine?
creepy. Yeah, I probably should have a hat. I'll use my iPad.
Oh,
Um,
that's not good. People will be seeing me sideways. That's not good.
it's so nice to see you.
Likewise, it's been forever.
Been forever, but I
Is
still
it?
remember sitting next to you at the Charlie Bird restaurant in Lower Manhattan, and we have to do it again
That
soon.
was such a lovely, yeah, that was such a lovely lunch, man.
But
It just really,
I'm going to ask you about this, but I still remember talking to you at Pinot Camp years ago. But so let's just start by God, you got a good view there. Thank you so much for getting out and tell me if it's
yeah.
raining. Let's start.
It's
Mimi,
not raining yet.
tell us who you are and where you are.
So I'm Mimi Castell. Hello, and we are on my estate in Oregon in the Willamette Valley. We're at the sort of neck of the seahorse that forms the Eola Amity hill chain, and
Okay,
I'll kind of show you the estate behind me
just beautiful. How high
there.
up are you?
Yeah. So right now, where I am at kind of the top of the vineyard, we're at about 500 feet. So
Oh, nice. So, can you tell me about Hopewell? I was just kind of doing my homework, and I just thought you made wine, but you're selling grapes too.
yes, we do. So essentially, I mean, I always hate repeating myself for people who are exhausted by the story, but basically, when I was still at Bethel Heights, the idea was that a lot of the experimentation that I was doing with the old own rooted vines um, could possibly fail, and that those vines would decline precipitously. And since they were such a foundational part of our estate program and part of our high end wines, we wanted to start growing another piece of the estate that would come into like its middle age as we started to lose those older vines at Bethel Heights. So we planted this vineyard thinking that it was going to sort of fill that niche, if you will. But when those old vines didn't die and they actually continued to not only do okay, but get better and, even produce a little bit more, I needed to find a home for the grapes. And so I started selling the fruit at first and really wanted to make the wines also. But there was really no room at Bethel Heights. We didn't want to expand production, um, which I still think was the right move. I feel like keeping our production small was part of being resilient through a lot of the things that we faced over the years. But then over time, it also just became where I was allowed to be as ambitious with my experiments as I wanted to be. So it's close to 25 acres planted, but it's an 80-acre piece. So a lot of it is um, you know in that type of habitat,
Huh?
and we're also actively restoring habitat in the areas that weren't planted. So historically, it was a Christmas tree farm. So it was under very intensive management prior to us being here. And one of the main goals of the project of Hopewell, not just the wines, is to really prove what we can do on the degraded landscape. So instead of thinking that we only have so much more land that we can take out of habitat and take into agricultural production, we need to be looking at the lands that we've already abandoned and say, you know, how can we take these back to health and start using the land that we've already converted better? So this is what it looks like now, but it didn't look like that 12 years ago.
Yeah, really. What do you mean by degraded? Can you explain that a little bit? I mean, I think I know, but for some people.
Absolutely. So, I mean, essentially, not a lot, an astonishing number of acres every year are abandoned agriculturally because the soils are quote unquote worn out. So, basically, due to overuse of chemicals, overuse of tillage, kind of repeated disturbance patterns that are very antithetical to maintaining good soil structure, you lose the capacity for plants to grow and thrive. And so farmers see decreases over time in their yields, decreases in time of quality, and they think, well, this is just, it's used up now. We've exhausted the resource, and that's becoming more and more, what people say is as they leave a trashed wasteland behind them, and that's what we're trying to prove, is that it doesn't have to be the end for that piece of ground.
So my grandparents had a farm in South Dakota, and every summer we would go there, and you would always see a field that was fallow. And as I understand it, you would say grow wheat or corn for 3 to 7 years, and then for a year you'd let it just be weeds or plant some other plant there. How do you do that in a vineyard when you have 25, 50-year-old vines?
Right. So the nice thing about grapes is that they're a perennial crop. And so the main difference there is that, they're there for the long run. They tend to be able to live with other things growing around them, even though that's not typically done. And so the idea of a fallow field is really because with annual crops, like row crops like soy and corn and things like that, they use a lot of nutrients. They use a lot of nitrogen. Some of them use a lot of carbon. A lot of them use a whole lot of calcium. And so back before there was a lot of chemical fertilizers, fallowing used to be the way to sort of restore those nutrients to the soil, because when you would allow a diverse, quote unquote, weedy cover to come back in for a whole year, the organic matter would return to the soil, and that would be the thing that fed your next crop. But then, sort of around the end of World War II, those things became commercially available because of the sort of excess nitrogen from, producing bombs for the war. And so chemical fertilizers.
Yeah, go ahead. Scared that
Sorry.
we don't make bombs, so let's put it in the dirt.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's very freaky when you study the history of how we've gotten to where we are. But it's also very much the way we've kind of stumbled into this very modern moment where, we have all this technology and so many tools at our behest, but we've been very kind of brutal with our tactics heretofore. I mean, we haven't known the havoc that we're wreaking until decades, if not centuries after the fact. And so those chemical fertilizers really are at the heart of why these lands are so degraded. Because when you're artificially feeding the soil, that chemical burden, in addition to the signal that you send to plants about where their nutrition really comes from, gets completely broken. So your plants no longer feed the soil microorganisms that are responsible for making that nutrition available to your crop plants. And so they basically die. They just die off. Those organisms don't stick around. If they don't have a food source of plant carbon, then they have no reason to be there, and they either die or they move on. And since most of them can't go very far, they die. And then those vacuums are filled by things like soil pathogens. And then we get massive crop die-offs because we have fungal diseases and other problems that live in the soil and just get more and more bad over time.
So, but some people say we have to do that because we have so many people we have to feed, and we have to be very efficient to get so much crop out of a land. What are alternatives? And I know this is talking beyond just grapes, but I know that you know these things. What are people, what's the argument and what are we doing?
Yeah, I mean, it has to do with the way that we've structured our agriculture to be about growing one crop only at one time, and it's the most efficient way. You plant it fence post to fence post and have nothing else growing, and then maybe you rotate that with one other cash crop that you grow every other year or every third year. And the problem with that, of course, is that nature doesn't want us to do things that way. One plant growing in one place does very little for the soil, for feeding soil microorganisms, for cycling nutrients, for doing all of the things that an ecosystem needs to have done, all of the functions that, plants do in an ecosystem. There's a reason why there's never just one. And usually why there's hundreds, if not thousands. So over time, you get this very simple, essentially laboratory style environment where if the plants aren't hooked up to an artificial machine, you can't produce crops efficiently. And so we've convinced ourselves, like with the baseline knowledge of chemical fertilization sort of being just acceptable, you think to yourself, well, I know that this is true because it's how we've been doing it for the last 75 years. But before that, we fed 3 times as many people on the same amount of land. And so what has really changed? It's not that the soil itself or what's possible and what's locked up in the soil is gone. It's just that those systems have been abused to the point that if we don't start bringing them back, they won't be productive anymore. It will take thousands, if not millions of years for those things to come back. But by farming intentionally and more intensively, so this is where an honest conversation about what it really means to be a farmer. If we want to feed 7 billion, 14 billion, 20 billion people, it can absolutely be done on the existing footprint that we have. But we have to accept that we need to grow multiple systems on one piece of ground. We need to have a fully functioning ecosystem with multiple food crops where you maybe have your summer vegetable garden, and then you have your winter crops, and you're all the time at the same time growing maybe tree crops, or in this instance we're growing wine grapes. But it can all be done if we change the way we think about what agriculture looks like on the landscape.
I always think of the beauty of Mexico, the way they used to plant corn so the bean would climb up it and the squash would spread out, and it's this beautiful triumvirate that actually feeds everything you need. And there's a way of doing it that people did for a long time. So wine is one of those things that you get an extraordinary amount of money for a thing growing in the earth. Like money is in the processing it in a way. But so I've always found that wine and wine growers are the forefront of just one example is dry irrigation. So can you explain again and maybe more what you're doing at Hopewell to kind of lead the conversation?
Sure. I mean, first and foremost, you can see on the ground here, we have year-long green, diverse perennial cover. We want to see hundreds of things growing throughout an entire calendar year on the floor, in the shrub layer, in the tree layer. And that really does, at a certain point and at certain thresholds in different ecosystems, once you reach a certain level of biodiversity, a lot of the things that follow that are the natural processes that get lost when you are sort of artificially farming, a laboratory style landscape. So the cycling of nutrients becomes more efficient, and the amount of biomass that you can produce in a finite piece of ground grows exponentially. What's beautiful about nature is that it makes infinity possible in a finite environment, because they're constantly growing new surface area. You're constantly growing new strata to create new sources of energetic connection. So new substrate for different energetic connections to be possible. And so where it used to be competitive, where things used to be competing, nature is red in tooth and claw, or whatever that phrase is, it then becomes cooperative, because as that system grows in productivity and in cycling of nutrients, more is made available on the same substrate. And so we can grow our wine grapes and get very decent, totally commercial yields and commercial profitability, while still being able to grow several rotations of at least grass, if not our wildflower crops and everything else that we're growing on the floor. I have kale and lettuce growing in the vine rows right now.
Really?
And not only is it, really nice to just be able to grab a handful of greens as you're walking through the vineyard, but it's incredibly nutritious. And you can taste that, those bitter compounds and those sour compounds that are, present in, a really, really great piece of romaine. You get that even in butter lettuce here, because it's growing in such a dynamic environment that those secondary plant metabolites are so much more. And so you can just taste when you're eating that whatever's growing here, you can taste how much more it's feeding you and so many fewer calories.
Can you grow enough to sell those secondary crops?
I mean, we do, but that's, you know, to do it commercially would be another level of regulation that I just don't have I don't have the bandwidth for. I don't want to be a huge operation, but I want to prove that it's possible. You know, with 80 acres, we could take all of these systems commercial and become like, I mean, one of my heroes is Joel Salatin from Polyface Farms. I mean, we could do that. But for me, the gift of doing things this way here is that we can do something real in our community to make change in the way, you know, the people who work with us feel about their job. So we're mostly at present, instead of going commercial with any of this stuff, we're feeding ourselves, we're feeding our crew, we're feeding right now the neighbors that, you know, can't shop because they're high risk groups for COVID, and my folks who are older and all that kind of thing. I mean, we can put together these beautiful boxes of food that will feed people and wine that will make them feel happier about the situation.
So how much of the grapes are you keeping for yourself to make Hopewell wine, and how much are you selling?
So it's about, I mean, the ratio ends up being about, we keep about 20 to 30% depending on the year.
Oh.
And we sell about 70. And that really helps to be able to have cash flow sort of spread out throughout the year, and also to be able to do some of the ongoing investments that we want to do in the farm. There's so much more that I am interested in doing, but we always have to kind of do it one project at a time because of budgetary restraints.
So what kind of vine, like viticulture practices are you doing differently? One of the things that I remember from Pinot Camp, I was saying that a friend of mine listened to podcasts when she was pruning, and you said, oh, I could never do that. I have to concentrate when I prune. And
Yeah.
I have been to enough vineyards, you don't ever see the pruning, but I did get to a couple times, and this project has actually gotten to learn about suckers and that kind of thing. So can you tell me about what viticulture practices you do that are different, and explain the pruning thing a little bit more to me?
Absolutely. So, I mean, I think for me, there are a couple of jobs that it's sort of like a good analogy for me is if you're exercising, you know, there's one type of exercise which is like just moving your body through space, that some people call it aerobic or cardio or whatever, but it's basically where you can totally tune out and it's not that big of a deal. But then there are those much more intentional exercises that you do to either build functional strength or flexibility, where using your mind and focusing your mind in that moment makes it so much more effective. And to me, pruning is sort of like strength training and flexibility training or balance training, where if you put your whole mind and all of your intention into that first and best influence on the architecture of your vines, it sets you up to be able to do every other job that comes after that so much faster and easier, and without so many moments of thought. So pausing over pruning, I think, is really worth it. I mean, I also think you should think about every job that you're doing in a vineyard, but I definitely listen to podcasts when I'm doing other things, but I don't do it when I'm pruning. And a lot of that's just because, you know, what you want in a dynamic environment like this is airflow for the vines, because our main concern here is really just disease. It's getting the fruit, you know, to harvest when it's clean and it's beautiful and it tastes perfect. And so maintaining that kind of open, I'm going to just switch this around here. So we are actually just finishing up the first shoot thinning pass. And so I think you can kind of see, you know, I'm going for architecture where we have a good open center and our heads are quite a bit below the fruiting wire, so that we have good options going forward without our heads coming too close up to the fruiting wire where things get really congested. And then I basically am forming two long-term established arms, because we're on double DO here. And then after that, once you have your arms on the cane, you want to just maintain that airflow by having good vertical shoot positioning, spaced widely enough apart so that there's really good airflow in there and those little clusters can see the sun. And
Uh-huh.
then, you know, then you're able to minimize the touches that you do for the rest of the season. It really sets you up in the best possible way to touch less. And that's, kind of at the heart of the viticultural philosophy here is you touch the vines less, you touch the wines less, you build a system that, kind of does what you want it to by affecting it the right way first.
So do you, because I've always felt it's kind of like a math problem, pruning. Do you learn over time if you see something coming out, you can kind of tell where it's headed?
For sure. I mean, I also do a lot of, just basic plant study. I've always been obsessed with plants, and the forms that plants want to take are very specific, and it is sort of you get to know where a plant wants to go. And what I've learned, and I've learned it, I think, many hard ways, is that it's just like with children or with people or even animals. Farm animals are the same way. The more you have to push something to get it to do what you want, the harder that battle is going to be for even longer. Yeah. So working with the natural form is in a lot of ways the best way to approach any type of perennial system. So trying to be um, really cognizant of that when you're pruning, like if you're having to just aggressively tip back your vines every year, the vegetative cycle is much bigger in that plant than you want it to be, and that's just too bad for you because it is doing what it wants to do. And there are lots of ways to address that, but I always like to try to listen to what the vines and what the system are trying to tell me, and not just try to smash it into the picture that I want it to look like, as quickly as possible. Because you can make things look a certain way for a very brief moment in time, but then if you want them to stay that way, you really do have to kind of work with the system that you have.
So you can only touch so many vines yourself, though. Do you find you're able to teach your crew that easily? I mean, I'm inspired listening to you, and I imagine your crew is too. But is it scalable for your team?
I mean, it's definitely been a really kind of beautiful and amazing challenge to try to work with a crew that I've worked with since I was a little kid. Really, some of them are in their 60s now, still doing just incredible work. But they've learned viticulture now so many different ways because they've been here for decades, and they've seen the way that the viticulture has changed from like the old spacing, own rooted vines to very dense sort of Burgundian style spacing. And then they work with me, and I start really lobbing bombs at everything. And the same crew still works for my family's vineyard and at Temperance Hill with Di. And what's interesting about that is that this walk that we've taken together and being able to communicate finally, just going to the trouble of learning some of that language in Spanish, to be able to communicate the philosophy behind it and why I know that this is going to take us 10 years at least to get the system even set up the way that I want to, so that we have the bones of what I want to then grow flesh on. And being able to communicate that finally, I mean, it took a really long time because for sure they came here at first wanting to do things the way they were doing them everywhere else. And it's difficult because you sound like a crazy person if nobody else is doing it that way. They're just like, they're worried that you're going to blame them when
Yeah.
shit hits the fan. But it's been really, really cool the last couple of years, just having some of the feedback from the crew members saying how much they've enjoyed just how many more birds have returned here, and watching the transition of like when we started planting here and nothing would grow here but thistles and blackberries, and now we have endangered species on property. I think that that's very rewarding to them. And then also just being able to participate in the growing of food and animal products as well. I mean, it's a very fulfilling kind of work. And I think at least we're getting to a place where they know what I'm trying to accomplish, and even if it sounds a little bit freaky to them, they're willing to. They know that I'm not going to hang it on them. They know that it's all on me.
Right. Well, and what do the neighbors think? Because whenever some farmer is doing something different, you get looks, and we're able to hear you. I really enjoyed your interview with Levy on the I'll Drink to That podcast. I've listened to it a couple times now, and
Wow.
people are saying on here, Mimi's the one to listen to, but people that don't get a chance maybe to hear you and talk to you, what do the farmers out there think?
I mean, for sure, at first, I had near like my neighbor farmers. I don't know if you can see. I'm gonna see if I can show it to you. Can you see down there the hazelnut trees with the orange kind
I
of in? Can you see it? I don't know. Can you? Let me see
passed out of their field.
here. Let me see if I can. I can't zoom. Anyway, you can see down past the border of the vineyard.
Huh?
There's a hazelnut tree farm. It looks very. It looks really different than the vineyard, and you can see how it's kind of orange or very light colored on the bottom.
Mm-hmm.
So I've had those neighbors and other neighbors come here and say, I don't want your weeds on my property, or you're going to crash this vineyard because there's too much competition. But it's been long enough, and we've been here long enough, and that I think it's actually honestly, in the last 3 years, it's amazing to me how many of these kind of old school farmers around who are still in charge of their land. I mean, we're surrounded by a lot of people who've just leased out their properties also, but who have come wanting to ask good questions about how you would start transitioning to a different type of agriculture. And it's really, really been so much more in just this last calendar year than I would have ever dreamed possible. And I can't chalk that all up to one thing, but I think that regenerative agriculture being part of a national conversation now has really changed the pace of how people are, kind of at least opening their minds to what might be another way. And then the idea that there might be some sort of federal investment money available, I think has started to change some people's minds. And then also just seeing how awesome it looks, I mean, just wanting to have something that looks so nice as opposed to something that looks like, I don't know, would you really want your kids playing there or anybody frolicking in that environment? It just looks healthy. It looks like you want to be a part of it. And anyway, that's what I like to think.
Yeah. So I sent you a picture the other day about there's somebody has an Instagram account about bees, and they're like, leave your front lawn to just go to flower. What are things that I have tried to get as many plants in my New York City little apartment just because I'm like, it's a little oxygen. But what can people do in an apartment or in a yard that can just increase biodiversity on their, besides supporting you and wineries like you? What can people do to support biodiversity?
Well, I mean, there are so many initiatives now, and in New York, there are so many, and I'd be happy to send you a couple that I know of,
I love it.
of like taking back that, what do you call it? It's not the sidewalk, but it's the part on either side of the sidewalk that.
Yeah. Or the little grass patch by the
grass patch. I mean, there are neighborhoods where the neighborhood has decided to take that part back and not have it be city maintained. So no spray orders, and then, kind of planting a suite of diverse wildflowers and perennial plants to feed bees and other pollinators. And, that also brings songbirds back to cities, which it's very difficult to maintain songbird populations in cities. And the most you can possibly hope to do is really just support them while they're moving from one place to the next. But there's so much you can do with just this very small piece of ground. And in an apartment, I think having a lot of just really nice house plants and, maybe even a little balcony vegetable garden it's very rewarding, and you can actually grow a whole lot of food that way. But mostly, I think it's that feeling that you're participating in the process of life that you don't necessarily feel otherwise when, you're kind of living your life day to day. But when you have something under your care that's green and needs sunshine and needs water, but it's not going to scream at you, it's not going to complain or, whatever the the human versions.
I had my last wine event. It was like a wine tasting thing, and I had a house plant cutting swap where I had people bring cuttings to trade because it's a cheap way to
Yeah.
increase your diversity in your own apartment. I'm going to let you go very quickly because I appreciate all your time and we're almost at a half an hour. But what do you think? This just your meta view of what we're going through right now. It's crazy, but there's got to be a way out. And part of the reason I did this project is because my friend said, Jeff, you're quarantined. I got to go plant the Shannon vines that I ordered. The vines don't stop. And you're thinking decades down the road for, the next, for that vineyard. And so it is very optimistic to plan towards the future. But
Yeah.
what do you think about that and the Corona stuff?
Well, obviously, I worry so much about my friends, our friends who, you know, how long can we sustain people who have, given their lives to restaurant service and hospitality and all of that, in this version of our reality? And that, that does keep me up at night. And also just everything. I mean, the ripple effect. So all that being true and very weighty, this is such an important moment for all of us. I think that one of the best and most frequent conversations I've had during quarantine is with people who are really seizing this opportunity to think about what their lives looked like just before this, and the fact that the very next day life looks incredibly different, and yet the world hasn't ended. And that means that we have an opportunity to decide what it looks like on the other side. And it doesn't have to look exactly the same as it did before we went in, because I think most of us would agree we don't need that much. We don't need that much of everything. We just need better everything. We need better quality everything. And so much interest right now in how to harness the energy that everybody's going to come charging out of their doors with and put that into our real and important future. And so I think, we're getting some rain now, so I'm sorry if my screen starts to get a little bit weird, but if I had one thing to say about this moment, it's like, it's given us the freedom to ask the question, I don't know how I got here, honestly. I mean, it's been a lot of just, momentum and inertia. But now I actually get it, that what I do next is really entirely up to me. And there's so much need right now to put people's energies into changing what climate change is going to mean for us. And if we were to harness that energy, even a quarter of that energy, we can make it so much better. And there's so many ways to help that I really hope that people can stay positive and think about how they want to use some of that energy, because I'll take some. and I know a lot of people in this, kind of regenerative space really are ready to kind of start bringing people in who want to do this work. And there's really no question that, we can affect great change right now. We could rewrite history today. And I really hope that we can at least see that little note of positivity in this tragic experience.
Thank you for that. That's just, I can't say anything more than thank you. That's a good way to end. And you're such an inspiration. I love following you and learning from you and listening to you. Thank you for taking the time and getting a little wet for us and showing us your beautiful vineyard.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for having me. It meant a lot to me that you asked, and I loved that lunch that we had together, and I really look forward to seeing you again soon.
Sooner rather than later. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Take
All
care.
right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.